We move on to part 2, the future of Europe, nonetheless, according to TerraNova. Peter Verburg is Principal Investigator, which is a title I would love to have, a Principal Investigator in TerraNova and Professor of Environmental Spatial Analysis at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam here, where he runs the Environmental Geography Group. His work on regional and global scale land use modeling has resulted in one of the most frequently used models worldwide. He will also, in his presentation, be welcoming 2 young researchers via Zoom. I would say, take it away. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marieke, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. While Sjoerd was mainly talking about how landscapes have evolved in the past, the evolution of landscapes, I will talk about the future. What is the future of our landscapes? And how do we manage those landscapes of the future? Land always had a lot of value to people. Wars have been fought for land. But land is getting more and more value in the future because we need land for almost everything. We need the landscapes for too many things. We have to protect biodiversity. We're in the middle of a huge biodiversity crisis, and we need more land for nature. We also want to protect the landscapes of the past, the landscapes where we have relational values to, the landscapes that tell us about our identity. And we need land for recreation. We know, and COVID has taught us, that we don't have enough land to recreate. Nature areas are overcrowded, and competition between land becomes real. And we know we need a different form of agriculture. We need to transform our agricultural systems to be more inclusive, to provide healthier and better foods. But we also know that those systems take more space. We need more land for better agriculture. And we're in the middle of an energy transition. Sjoerd was already talking about the energy regimes. And we're again in one energy regime shift where we're now using biomass, we're using land for solar panels, wind farms, for our energy transition, again requiring more land. And of course, we want to live in green cities. We want to work in places. And again, this is threatening other landscapes. So different types of landscapes are competing for space. We want it all. We want it now, and we need it now. We have a climate crisis. We need more forest to sequester carbon. We need more land for all those different purposes. How do we manage our landscapes for all these different claims? What are the pathways to the future? What are the solutions to these increasing competition for land? I will talk about that using a book of Charles Mann, who puts 2 different perspectives of looking to that. The one from innovation and technology, the wizard way of solving the future, or the way of real transformations, systemic change in the way we interact with the land, the way we consume, the lifestyles that we are having. But first, starting with the technology pathway, the wizard. And the request for art really is taking place. If you go to a museum, we cannot go to museums now, but virtually we can go, and we look at old historic landscape paintings of Europe. We often see landscapes where there's not a lot of trees, not a lot of forests. And this is because we were having very extensive farming systems, grazing everywhere, fuel wood collection everywhere. And because technology helped us to be intensifying our farming systems and helped us to different energy sources, we were able to use less land for our food production with more people. And this has resulted, and this is one of those historic reconstructions, not for a long time, but already in 1 century, we see a lot of greening of the landscapes in time. Agricultural technology, energy technology, and the import of food through globalization has spared land that we use for our food production, which could be reassigned to forests, nature, and other uses. So that's a very positive perspective where technology has helped us to decrease the competition for land resources. And also, if we look towards land use models for the future, and you see in this colorful painting with possible developments of land use change, we see these green areas where we still expect agriculture to be abandoned and making place for rewilding or other uses. And that brings me to the, brings me to the pitch of Catherine Fayet. Catherine Fayet is one of our early career researchers, and she is studying actually exactly what happens after this agricultural abandonment. She holds 2 master degrees, one in applied and effective psychology and one in environmental resource management. And she is a PhD candidate based at IUCN in Brussels. So the floor is for Catherine.
The abandonment of agricultural lands poses many challenges for European landscape management. Drivers and environmental impacts of abandonment are well understood. But like many landscape changes, abandonment is not always an end state. This is why we explored in a literature review what are the different trajectories that we can find after abandonment. We found 3 main directions for post-abandonment trajectories. First, lands can return to agricultural uses after a temporary state of abandonment. Second, and this was the most frequent trajectory, abandoned lands can enter a revegetation process which can either be managed with afforestation and restoration interventions or spontaneous with natural succession. A third option is the urbanization of these lands. This categorization highlights that various opportunities can be developed from abandonment trajectories. We can choose to spare lands. It can be the case for lands that are not productive enough and where abandonment brings opportunities for the return of natural processes that benefit to land restoration and biodiversity recovery. We can also choose to use lands better. This can be shown with a return to agricultural uses trajectories that it is not only about consuming less, but also about consuming better. We can think, for instance, of cultural landscapes like terraces or high nature value farmlands like semi-natural grasslands, where abandonment can be a threat for biodiversity, local economy, and cultural heritage. In this case, we can choose to support a low-intensive reuse of the land, which can be done with multifunctional and sustainable forms of agriculture. But how these different trajectories develop? We identified 2 types of patterns for the drivers of abandonment. First, with passive trajectories, the most common driving force of semi-natural landscapes was the absence of management, hence allowing spontaneous revegetation. By contrast, active trajectories refer to all cases where something else happened after abandonment. In this case, institutional drivers at least were involved, like subsidies or national programs for the reuse of the lands, and they were often combined with economic incentives. So what is the way forward? Landscape managers need to be able to make informed choices on land transitions after abandonment. For that, stronger institutional and economic support is key to provide a frame for action that enable land management, for instance restoration and vegetation control, where it is appropriate and needed. Local characteristics of the area should also be considered to avoid negative impacts of the land transition and maximize opportunities to contribute to current environmental policy goals like the one defined by the EU in the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your insights on your research on these different pathways of what happens after this land is spared from agriculture towards being used for different new purposes. But there is a trade-off to this nice positive development, because this goes hand in hand with an intensification of agriculture, which leads to a lot of problems with pesticides, intensive livestock keeping for health and environment. Also, a lot of this land no longer used for agriculture is a result of being us in Europe importing many more commodities, feed for animals and other agriculture, forest products from other countries. So by importing food, we're exporting our environmental problems. So there's limits to this sparing of land and the new opportunities that are brought by abandonment of agricultural areas in Europe. So then, what's the alternative? Technology will help us, but it will not be able to deal with all the competing claims that we have. And that's where the profit comes into the game. We need to go beyond implementing technology to deal with the competition for land. We need to also change our consumption and production relations. And this is also one of the Sustainable Development Goals that gets the least attention in research, is that there's a strong connection between land use and what we consume in terms of energy and what we consume in terms of food. So I would like here to reframe the land sparing by land sparing has to not only come by increasing technology and more efficient land use, land sparing also has to become from more responsible consumption. And a very important aspect into that is our consumption of meat. We already talked about it in the previous discussion a little bit. But if we look at the large area of Europe that is currently used for agricultural production, and the even larger area that we use abroad to produce all the animal feed, we know that we cannot spare land if we do not change our consumption. And if we do that, if we are able to release our pressure on the land, we have more space to share the land in the areas where we're living and where we are producing things. So we have to navigate the trade-offs between the different uses. And trade-offs between different uses are not unavoidable. If we increase our agricultural production, it's almost unavoidable that we lose some biodiversity. But by designing our landscapes in a clever way, and we used to be very good at that also in the past, and that's where we also can learn from, we can navigate a trade-off by limiting the trade-off. There's different ways of dealing with trade-offs, and that's where more clever solutions in landscape can come in. There's also the place where science can help. How do the different uses of land conflict? And what are the different options we have for a piece of land and what to do best at what place? And this is where I would like to introduce the next pitch, which is of our young researcher and PhD candidate, Leen Felix. Leen Felix graduated as an ecologist at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And she will explain to us how her research in the TerraNova project is contributing to quantifying those trade-offs on a European scale between the different possible functions that the land is having. Leen, the floor is yours.
As Peter explained, the future landscape of Europe will have to find a balance between land sparing and land sharing, creating a landscape where we have both high yield farming, wildlife-friendly farming, and undisturbed nature. Obviously, this also means that the trajectories of intensification, extensification, and land abandonment will each play a role in this. Each of these trajectories has very different effects on biodiversity and ecosystem services, the benefits that are provided by ecosystems to society. Therefore, there are trade-offs between different landscape planning objectives. This figure shows the characteristic impact profiles of each trajectory, including 10 impacts that we deem to be relevant for European scale landscape planning. Important here is that the degree to which each of these typical trajectory costs and benefits occur varies highly throughout Europe, and because of that, so does their desirability. So if ideally we want to maximize each of these indicators, but there is only limited space, using space efficiently is key. In order to do so, we need to prioritize each trajectory in areas where its benefits are maximal and its costs are minimal. So this brings us to the research question. What are the most and least desirable areas for the intensification, extensification, and abandonment of agricultural land? And I will now go through the steps that we took in our current research to help answer this question. We started with modeling on a 1 square kilometer resolution the spatial variation of each trajectory's potential impact on the 10 ecosystem service and biodiversity indicators that I showed earlier, resulting into 26 potential impact maps, of which only the extensification impacts are shown here on the slide. You can see how the potential impacts of extensification show very different spatial patterns across Europe. We then calculated the number of costs and benefits that exceeded the impact thresholds of moderate, high, and very high. You can see how in some regions, the impacts are very low, with few exceeding even the moderate threshold. As the threshold increases, less regions have high numbers that exceed them. So generally, you can see how within all countries, there are areas with both low and high benefits and costs. Some regions, like southern Italy, show generally low sensitivity, whereas others, like parts of northern Italy, for example, show very high sensitivity to each trajectory. So next, we combined each trajectory's costs and benefits into a single cost versus benefit map, where you can see where the benefits are high in comparison to the costs and the other way around. So here, we clearly see that there is great variation in cost-benefits combinations, and particularly so for abandonment. Lots of regions have both high costs and high benefits, and not so many have low costs and low benefits. So I'd like to conclude with saying that this large variation in each trajectory's ecosystem service impact, their total costs and benefits, and their cost versus benefit maps suggests that there are great differences in their desirability, even at a sub-regional scale. This variation tells us that agricultural and conservation policies that support or prevent each trajectory are much needed. However, when they are applied without spatial targeting, they will just counteract each other, and this might lead to ineffectivity. So to end on a more positive note, this also means that we can get more out of less land, if only we unlock the potential of spatial prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leen. You have exactly done what I was hoping for in showing how science and scientific modeling can support decision-making for the future. You've shown that it's not a choice between two landscape options, it's a choice about what to do where. There's a huge spatial variation across Europe. The landscapes are very different. And depending on what we do where, we have trade-offs, but they are not always as severe. By one change in the landscape, we can have a large benefit at one place, which may not work at another place. And that's exactly the role that we envision for our future landscape managers, that they bring into scientific nuance, scientific insights into the debate. They help to describe, explain, and explore the future of the landscapes of Europe, helping to design, but also, and maybe more importantly, initiate a societal debate about what future do we want? What is our vision of future landscapes? Are these multifunctional landscapes, or are these optimized landscapes? Are these the landscapes that are embedded in our past? Or do we really make a transition to a novel future for using very different lifestyles and very different ways of interacting with nature? And that's where the science and society come together in the larger picture of future landscape management. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter, and also, of course, thank you so much to Leen and to Catherine for your insights. And all these questions you were just posing right now, I just wanted to get into them and get you to answer them for me. But of course, I understand that you feel that your role as a scientist also is to sort of spruce the debate about it and make sure that society gets, enough information to be able to, talk about these things and debate what will be the optimal sort of land use for us. Thank you so much. That is really, really insightful. Now let's see what the audience thinks about these subjects. So what do you feel? Head over to Mentimeter right now, where we've got a few questions for you in store again. The first one I think is really interesting. Are you a land sparer or are you a land sharer? It'll be good to see how people feel that they are on a scale. You can move the bar and see if you are 100% on this side. Most people feel they're in the middle right now, you see? Actually, almost everyone.
That's surprising.
Is it? Tell me.
Yes, often I'm wondering if people feel they're in the middle or if the average is in the middle.
That is a good question.
Often people
Yes.
have very different visions
Yes,
about the future of the land.
there you go.
And maybe people took my message that it depends on location.
Well, it does, right? So,
It does.
yes,
It can be a land sparer and a land sharer at the same
at
time.
the same time.
And maybe
Yes.
that's a nice result,
Yeah.
seeing that back.
Yeah, let's see what maybe Leen and Catherine think about this. I haven't interacted with you. Hello, good to meet you.
Hi.
Hey, hello. What do you make of this result?
Yeah, I think I agree with Peter that maybe means that we've done a good job.
Yes, well, congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, the debate is normally very polarized, and I think this might I also put myself somewhere at the middle towards land sparing, but I think it's good to see a nuance too. So I'm happy about it.
Good stuff. Yeah, interesting. I do wonder, though, whether there's quite some people who are polarized and very much, on both sides, and we sort of see the average. That will be interesting to know. But that, indeed, when we put them all together, that is where they end up. So that is really interesting. Let's move on to the next question. How do we persuade politicians to act in favor of sustainable landscape management, which of course is very important? Again, elections coming up in the Netherlands in a few weeks, but also of course all over the world, how policymakers and governments decide upon what the land is being used for makes a big difference, of course, in how we can make sustainable change in the world. So is more emphasis needed on the economic, the cultural, or the environmental costs and benefits of sustainable landscape management? Peter, can you read this?
No, I cannot.
No. Oh, I'm happy to hear that, because
No.
I just feel like a blind bat, because the sentences are sometimes really small for us to read. But if they are in good order, that will mean that most people now vote for the economic costs and benefits of sustainable landscape management. I'm going to quickly walk over there and see if I'm right. Yes, economic, cultural, environmental. There we go. Good, yes. So we have most votes now for economic, then one less, actually, for cultural, and then there's the same amount for environmental. Let's see if there's a few more popping in. Otherwise, I'm going to... Oh, and now all of a sudden it's switched to environmental cost benefits, because I was surprised that that was the lowest one, to be honest. So I'm quite happy.
It's concerning.
It is slightly concerning. Yeah, you're right. But this, yeah, so this looks different now. So now we have economic, slightly less for cultural, and the same amount for environmental. Let's head back maybe to Leen and Catherine to see how they feel about this result and if they would agree with this.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. So I think that all of them are very important, but I can see that it reflects also preoccupations of people, that we also have the economic aspects that are very important to be able to do actions on the land, and it also something that matters a lot. But environmental aspects are also really key, and they're also related to economic aspects and cultural aspects as well. So we need all of them, I think, and highlights that that there is a balance that sometimes needs to be prioritized in some areas and sometimes we need to prioritize something else. So I think it reflects the reality of decision making, I guess.
There you go. So we could have also maybe put in all of the above, right? But we sort of made people choose here. So we need, of course, all of these factors into making a change. I want to sort of refer back very quickly to the slide we had just earlier where you could choose your position as a land sharer or a land sparer. I've indeed have confirmation now that the average was the middle that we saw. So that is good to know. I'm going to go to the last audience question. Do historical reconstructions matter in giving inspiration to future landscape managers? Yes, they need to learn from the past. No, not really. The world is changing so fast nowadays that little information can be used from the past, or historical constructions can help avoiding repeating mistakes. Let's have a quick look. I think both the first and the third option are essentially yes answers, so that's what people are going for. The no, not really, is not very popular, which I could imagine among this group. It would be concerning to me as well if people felt that there was nothing to be learned from the past.
Although, to give an argument for that,
Go on.
is that our relations of how we deal with the land, which we always have been seen as a resource we can take from, we have to drastically change.
Yes.
So in that sense, I would provide also an argument of stepping away from the past in changing our relations. But of course, the other two answers are also correct. We also need to learn. But I still believe, and I see I have a follower.
You do. You've got a fan.
We also need to really transform the ways we use the land and we see and value the land.
We absolutely need a transition, right? We can't just continue the way that we have for us to be able to have a sustainable future in that sense. So that's really important. Still, the majority, well, the massive majority, also agree with you in the answer, yes, we have to learn from the past, which is essentially also a little bit, that view on knowing what doesn't work and what we need to change. So thank you so much for that. I've got a question from the audience for you. Would it be possible to have fully overlapping land uses where protection, production and recreation are combined and meat need is fulfilled by grazing animals, for instance, rewilding, agroforestry or safari?
It's a very good question. And to a certain extent, yes, we need a full overlap, especially in our densely populated areas where we want to have local food, we want to recreate, and to have the local agricultural system function, we need biodiversity in it to avoid pests, to have pollinators, and so on. But we cannot have all biodiversity in those shared landscapes. Certain species, certain ecosystems can only function when they are left alone or largely undisturbed. That's where we need to set aside land for those functions. But on the remaining area, we have to see what are the needs of society and what are the needs for a long-lasting, functioning landscape, also for future generations. And that's where we have overlapping functions. They will never fully overlap. There will be trade-offs, but we should ensure that they are functioning, and a certain level of overlap is needed.
Yes, that's very interesting. I'm going to go to Leen and Catherine to see if they have anything to add to that. There you are. Go ahead. The answer might be no. This was the perfect answer and there's nothing to add to that. That's possible.
I think Peter made a really nice answer and highlighted there are many elements that we need to balance, and we can have biodiversity and recreational uses in some cases, but not everywhere. We can try to improve biodiversity in cities as well, and also maybe in more remote areas we can have different biodiversity as well. So I think it really depends on the local context and mitigating trade-offs to manage at the best option possible.
Thank you so much to the both of you, and best of luck with your fascinating and very important work. And thank you so much for joining us today as well. Peter, maybe as a last question, and I'm going to also maybe challenge you to sort of give me an answer, maybe one or two sentences. Maybe a definition almost as sort of roundup of this session. What is future landscape management, including rewilding, if you like, according to TerraNova? What does that look like?
That's a very difficult question to answer in one sentence.
Well,
Now,
I'll give you two.
Left,
I'll give you two.
but it's
Yes.
it's the challenge of having a vision of the future and analyzing the trade-offs between competing uses and navigating those to find good landscapes that ensure well-being of humanity for the future.
There you go. If you want to have an answer like that to your question, of course, don't hesitate to put your questions for all our speakers in Mentimeter. Thank you so much, Peter. I'm going to welcome back Sjoerd. Thank you so much for joining us again. Now, having listened to all this input from our speakers, from the audience, the questions, the input, what strikes you most in this session? What is like, hey, hello, that's interesting?
Well, it strikes me what Peter also quoted already, that science gives you an answer. And as in TerraNova, we combine science and humanities. And we also need to give this message over, I think, to a lot of other disciplines as well. So the collaboration of sciences we employ in TerraNova is especially meant also to bring over this message, what Peter now is advocating, to bring to policymakers. So in TerraNova we have a plan to reach out to policy makers on a regional to local level, to a national to a European level. And so we're actually building also on this comprehension. So I totally agree. It's a complex landscape, and it's a very difficult message, but we need to maybe, if it's difficult, complex, you may to bring it step by step.
Yeah.
So start small and make it bigger.
That's a nice route, I think, for people to be able to go along with you. Yes.
Hopefully, yeah.
How about yourself, Peter? What was something that really struck you today and you were like, hello, that is interesting?
You know what I found interesting was, I think, the story of Elena also about baselines. Going back, looking at what was the past and how did we get used to all those changes and how these baselines have been shifting. And I think that's one of the largest dangers also for the future, that we get used to landscapes that are no longer functioning. And I think it's not only about the exact baseline, but it's also about our learning from that process on how the reality is changing and our perception is changing.
Yeah.
Yes, so we look at that very differently now than we did maybe 100 years ago, even. Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting, that shifting baseline syndrome, what Elena touched upon, and when she gave her pitch, indeed also means that, for example, to the Romantic period, which is about 200 years ago, the Romanticism, 200-300 years ago, people at that time considered nature as something wild and something dangerous, and there was another perception also to nature. So that also gives you that today we have maybe a different opinion to nature. And it's so important to get this longer perspective on it, and to let people used, in fact, to the fact that we already have had enormous amounts of different changes in landscape perceptions, and that we might as well change again. And
why not? Well, we have to. We have to. So if through some sort of magic our viewers wake up tomorrow and can have only remembered one thing from this session, what would you like them to take away from this? And
First thing springs to my mind is very strange, but eat less meat.
It's not strange. I think it's vital.
I think it's vital.
It's vital.
Peter said we need these foodscapes. They need to be changed drastically.
Yeah, drastically. Yes. Thank you.
It's our consumption that determines the future.
Yeah.
But it's also about having a vision, and that's also the role as a scientist. In the supermarket, when you buy food, when you choose to commute or not, or travel, energy use.
People underestimate their power so immensely. They underestimate their own power in this change so much.
Exactly. But there's also power with companies, in value chains, in policy. And that's where also the power of the citizens in elections.
There you go, because we need laws as well, don't we? Why is this still legal to exploit and to really sort of not just exploit people, but also animals and landscapes elsewhere for our meat and our consumption here? I think that's for me, that's still something that's very strange.
It's what we call the old economy. And
Yes, there we go.
From an old economy to a new economy which has a more balanced vision, also how to make future landscapes. And that also means exactly what you're saying, that we don't need to export meat to the rest of the world and have our landscape suffering from it.
There you go. Thank you so much, Sjoerd, Peter, and I'm going to, of course, go and meet you again later at the end of this day.